Welcome back. Before spring break, we started a lecture on the Great Depression. Unfortunately, we didn't get to finish that and we have an interruption. So we are picking up where we left off. Before we actually jump into the lecture itself, where we left off, I'm going to provide you a little bit background information, reminding you where we were. Hopefully you have your notes with you, you brought them home, so that we can move forward. A depression occurs when there's a lack of liquid capital. Either there's not enough capital, right, enough mass of capital, or the velocity of capital slows down. It doesn't move from hand to hand. In either instance, prices start to fall. Deflation. Once deflation sets in, unemployment skyrockets. Individuals don't have the capital, the cash, to purchase. That lack of demand prompts a drop in prices. The businesses are reluctant to drop their prices because they have expenses. The one expense they can shed really, really fast is employment. Once employment falls off, then more people lacked capital, cash, and so they then can't purchase, and there's a ripple effect, a wave that sweeps through the economy. This is what happens in a depression. A lack of liquid capital prompts a collapse in the financial markets. During a depression, the raw materials don't go away, the production facilities don't go away, the distribution networks are all intact. Right? Those are the foundations for a well-functioning economy. What goes away or what breaks is financial capitalism. Individuals invest at a risk in order to make a profit. The collapse of the New York financial market sucked the liquid capital out of the global economy. Why did that happen? Well, because of the economic consequences of the peace. The treaties of Paris, the Peace of Paris, including the Treaty of Versailles, tied American financial markets to European governments. European governments took out loans from American bankers in order to meet the demands of a failing economy after World War I. When American bankers got into trouble, they called in those loans, sucking the liquid capital out of the European market, collapsing European and American economies. I think you can understand at this particular moment how quickly financial markets can collapse and how quickly that leads to mass unemployment. We've already covered reparations. We looked at the U.S. origins of the financial collapse, both with margin trading and with the speculation in investment trust. We had just started the European ramifications. So this video is going to focus on the European ramifications, and you'll have your notes for the previous two sections. This video will also include a conclusion to this lecture. It won't be a separate video, so it'll be a little bit longer. When we do future videos, they'll have the introduction, the body, and the conclusion separated out for you. The collapse of the New York financial markets spread almost immediately to Europe. That led to a collapse of the trade cycle. Europeans stopped buying American goods, Americans stopped buying European goods, and when one person stops buying, another person has no income. One person's spending is another person's income. Without income, your entire business can collapse. One of the key features of the modern economy is the interconnectedness of global financial and product markets. So for example, in Eastern Europe, agricultural prices fell from $2.76 to 60 cents. Right? This is an index. We've explained indexes before. It's a way to measure large changes over time. And so agricultural prices on average were about $2.76 before the Great Depression. Within a year, they were at 60 cents. Hungarian production, for example, was cut in half to 50%. In Great Britain, exports fell to the United States from 46 million to 29 million pounds. That's an incredible loss of income. That loss of income then resulted in the unemployment rate in England climbing to 15%. In France, the traditional industries survived, but the newest industries, the car manufacturers, airplane manufacturers, they all collapsed. On the other hand, agriculture in France remained relatively untouched. They had enough domestic demand where they were able to survive. In Germany, one of the leading manufacturers by the 1920s, industrial production was cut in half, 50%. By 1932, unemployment rose to 30%. Germany was one of the hardest hit parts of the world economy. So the American financial collapse was not simply a US problem, it was a global phenomenon. We can then put these unemployment rates side by side and compare the damage, so to speak. This chart's a little bit misleading because it's a quick jump from 1923 up to 1930 on the left-hand side of the chart. From 1930, 31, 32, 33, 34, they're 1 year increments on the right-hand side of the chart. So you have to realize that in 1929 to 1930, that is a relatively accurate steep climb, but that first number on the beginning, 1923, is a little bit deceptive because it just doesn't jump up right away. But the chart does illustrate quite nicely that all of a sudden, within a 3-year period, European and American manufacturers and businesses shed workers. Those workers had no salary, they had no income, they had no capital, they lost purchasing power, which means on the flip side, businesses had no one to sell to. Right? This creates not only a lack of liquid capital because of mass, but it also creates a lack of liquid capital because of velocity. The money is not changing hands fast enough because people who do have capital, because people who do have jobs don't want to spend it because they're afraid they won't be able to pay a future bill. You can see also on this chart then, Great Britain, while suffering, not as much. The United States and Germany, who were two of the fastest growing economies in the world in the late 19th and early 20th century, they got hit hard. The devastating business losses, the devastating employment losses, all of those losses combined prompted a rethinking of European economic tradition. A leader in that movement was John Maynard Keynes. Keynes had already appeared on the scene with the Economic Consequences of the Peace, talking about the negative impacts of the Treaty of Versailles, emphasizing the interconnectedness of the European economy, that the sales from one country represented income from another, so that by punishing Germany, the Allies were actually punishing themselves. A person or a business or a country that wants income needs to have a strong partner who can spend. John Maynard Keynes continued to develop his ideas, and in the Great Depression, he provided the intellectual challenge to laissez-faire. We're going to focus on one part of that challenge and his objection to Say's law. Say's law was developed by Jean-Baptiste Say, a French economist in the 19th century. At this point, you would probably ask me, well, what did Say say? And I would say that Say said, laissez-faire was the proper government response to economics. The government should keep its hands off. Adam Smith had already developed that idea, Say created a corollary or a law to explain, to his mind, why laissez-faire was the correct response to economic troubles. Say argued that supply creates demand. Capitalist. Individuals with accumulated liquid capital invest their money at a risk in order to make a profit. They create supply. I want to produce shoes. So I'm going to produce a supply of shoes. Well, in order to do that, as a businessman, as a capitalist, I need to be able to buy real estate, a factory. I need to buy machines that go into that factory. I need to hire workers. I need to have leather. So before economic opportunity or economic activity starts, a businessman takes their accumulated capital and begins spending, thereby creating demand. The government needed to get out of the way of those capitalists. Any restrictions on or obstacles to supply hurts the economy as a whole. And so Say used this law, supply creates demand, in order to argue for laissez-faire, even in times of depression. That individuals with accumulated capital, because there were still people who had money even in time of depression, they were afraid to invest it because they were afraid of the negative consequences of government action. And so they held on to their capital instead of investing it. Keynes pointed out the deficiencies of that way of thinking. Keynes showed how government action can play a positive role in the economy, especially in times of depression. Because in times of depression, there is fear. People are holding on to their liquid capital, which then means that there is a ripple effect in the economy. It was very easy to see in the late 1920s and early 1930s that a supply of a product doesn't matter if there are no consumers. Right? There were factories left idle. There were apartment complexes left empty. There were storefronts left empty. There were goods on the shelf sitting there. Why? Because there weren't enough consumers. Consumers did not have the capital to purchase, right? Because capital is not simply about investment. Capital also is used for purchasing. And so if there are investors but no consumers, then the economy is going to stay stalled. So what could the government do? The government could prime the pump. Now this analogy is similar to one of those hand pumps like Granny from the Beverly Hillbillies, right? It is a suction pump. You have to pour water in order to get water out, right? Now that's an odd concept. You have to pour a bucket of water in to create enough suction. Same thing happens with a diesel engine. If you have a diesel engine has, in order for it to work, if it goes dry, you have to pour a little bit of diesel in order to prime the pump to get it working again. I prefer an analogy of like a Volkswagen Beetle. Right? My dad had one when I was growing up. It was a stick shift, and if the battery went dead or the starter went out, you could push it, and when you pushed it, got enough momentum going, you could pop the clutch and it would turn over the engine and it would start running on its own. I like this analogy better because sometimes, right, depending upon the size of the vehicle or whether it's on a flat or a hill, it depends on how much effort you have to do to push. If you're on a flat surface with a very small vehicle, you can push it relatively easy. Maybe one person pushing is enough. But if you're at the top of the hill and you can get it over the top of the hill, you can push it just a little, and it doesn't even take much, and it starts to go down in momentum. You can pop the clutch and it gets going. On the other hand, if you have a very large vehicle, rather than a Volkswagen Beetle, you're going to take several people, 3 or 4 people. This is the same thing that happens in an economy. The larger the economy, the bigger the amount of push that needs to happen. the more capital that must be injected into the demand side of the economy in order to get the pump moving again. So Keynes argued that government spending creates consumers. It's consumer spending that creates supply. Once investors realize that someone is out there to buy their product, those investors are going to open their checkbook and start taking the capital out of their pocket. Until they see consumers, investors are going to hold back and not restart private businesses. Government spending acted as a pump priming mechanism. It got liquid capital flowing in the economy again. Now, this was hard for people trained in 19th century economics to accept. It was hard for politicians to accept because they were all told that at a time of economic collapse, you need to tighten your belt. Well, everybody around the world was tightening their belt. Everybody around the world was stopping spending. And when everybody stops spending all at once, the economy collapses. In order to prevent that from happening, investors and consumers need to know that they are going to get money, and that money will allow them to buy food, buy clothing, pay their rent. Once they do that, the liquid capital starts to circulate again. Government spending was not the only tool that the governments around the world had. They also had monetary policy. The European currencies had all been tied to gold before the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, there was a great experiment going on around the world with new money. Adam Smith had already articulated this in the late 18th century. It was not by gold or by silver, but by labor that all the wealth of the world was originally purchased. So before there was gold and silver, before there was money, paper money, there was labor. So wealth of a nation, it depends upon the produce, the products, the encouraging of labor, not gold or silver. It was hard for governments in the 1930s to give up the gold standard. But the countries that left the gold standard first were the governments and the countries that got out of the Great Depression faster. So on this chart we see Japan was the first to leave the gold standard in 1930. Once Japan got off the gold standard, its industrial production went up. Great Britain also left the gold standard in 1930. Its industrial production went up. Germany left it in 1932. Germany went up. The United States was one of the last to leave the gold standard. It went up. France, by the way, never left the gold standard until 1937. And by that time, France was continuing along the Great Depression. So the countries that left the gold standard, that started printing money, as people would say, money that was tied to the wealth of the nation and not to gold and silver, those countries experienced a rise in industrial production. Why? Because during the Great Depression, there's a lack of liquid capital. That liquid capital can either come from spending, income, right? John Maynard Keynes talked about that aspect, or it can come from monetary policy. It can come from banks lending more. Well, banks couldn't lend more because their money supply was tied to the gold standard. By deviating from the gold standard, banks could then lend more money freely, and when they lent money freely, industrial production picked back up. The European ramifications of the Great Depression then are twofold. One, the economic ramifications of the high unemployment, loss of business, bankruptcy, and then also the rethinking of economic priorities. Should the priorities be placed on investors and taking care of investors, or should the priority be placed on wage earners and people who are working for a living? Governments realized without workers there is no spending. Without spending, businesses collapse. If a government wanted to reignite its economy, the first thing it needed to do was to give people money, put them back to work, and get out of that hole. You can't get out of a hole if you keep digging. The only way to get out of a hole is to start filling it back in, and that's what Keynes taught European governments and American governments to do. While the Depression started in the United States, no one ever called it the American Depression. It was a world depression. It was a global depression. It was a Great Depression. It impacted everyone in the modern world. It was a lack of liquid capital in circulation. Businesses didn't go away, right? The buildings didn't go away. The roads didn't go away. The factories didn't go away. They were still there. They were just idle, right? This idleness started in the American financial markets and then quickly spread to Europe because of the reparations and the other loans tied to World War I. The countries that abandoned traditional economic answers fared better than countries that held on to traditional economics. Those countries that adopted Keynesian economics, those countries that abandoned the gold standard, did much better than those countries trying to hold on to their traditional conservative thoughts. So there are two ways of looking at this Great Depression. One is through the material impact, obviously, loss of jobs, loss of food, loss of shelter. But there's also a spiritual aspect. There's also a deflating of the human soul, that after the shock of World War I, just a few short years later, comes this economic slap, and the individuals who lived through both of them felt depressed, emotionally, spiritually. They felt abandoned by the leadership around the world. And it's in those times of despair that individuals and communities had to decide on a new way forward. So there was a material impact to this Great Depression, but also, as we're going to see, a severe spiritual, emotional reaction also.